on friendship and the emotions in the Hebrew Bible. I'm Arthur Urbano, professor of theology at Providence College and chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. And I'm really pleased to welcome our guest from across town from Brown University, Professor Saul Olyan. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening, familiar faces and new faces as well. Because of the pandemic, we've held our last several events on Zoom. So this, of course, has meant that we've not been able to gather together in person on campus as we usually do to enjoy a glass of wine and conversation together before the event and to linger to chat afterwards. But the upshot of Zoom has been that we've had new friends, so to speak, who've been able to join us from across the country, even across the world. And so on behalf of the JCTE committee, I welcome all of you here this evening. If you'd like to know more about our program or see videos of previous talks, you can visit our website, which is jewish-catholic.providence.edu, and I'll put that in the chat when I finish my introduction. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Jews Catholics PC. And if you'd like to be on our email list, you can send a message to jcte@providence.edu. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to go over tonight's format. First, we'll hear from Professor Olyan, and his talk will be followed by a response from Professor Long. Following their presentations, there will be some time for Q&A. During the Q&A, if you have a question, we ask you to click on the raise hand feature in the reactions menu down at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Father John Allard, who will help moderate the Q&A session, will call on you, and then you can unmute and ask your question. You can also enter questions at any time into the chat feature, and questions in the chat will be read out either by Father John during the Q&A session or myself. Throughout the course of the evening, we do ask that you kindly keep yourself muted and only to unmute if you are asking a question during the Q&A. Tonight's event is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. So if you do not wish to be seen in the recording, you should keep your camera off throughout the duration of the event. So with that, I'm happy to introduce tonight's speakers. Professor Saul Olyan is Samuel Ungerleider Jr. Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University, where he has taught since 1992. He specializes in the Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism. He's the author of 8 books, including Friendship in the Hebrew Bible, and most recently, Violent Rituals of the Hebrew Bible. He is also editor or co-editor of 13 volumes, including Animals in the Law and Antiquity, and Social Theory and the Study of Israelite Religion. He served as the coordinating editor of Brown Judaic Studies from 2001 to 2016, and is currently a member of the editorial board of the Anchor Yale Bible Series and on the advisory board of Avar, an interdisciplinary journal of life and society in the ancient Near East. Professor Stephen Long received an MA in Classics from the University of Virginia in 2006, and a PhD in Theology in the subfield Christianity in Judaism and Antiquity from the University of Notre Dame in 2018. He's taught Greek in Idaho and been a Fulbright Scholar in Göttingen, Germany. He joined the faculty of Providence College in 2019 and is a member of the JCTE committee. His main research interests include biblical law, wisdom literature, and the Psalms, with some side interests in contemporary treatments of the Trinity, Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, and theological anthropology. When he's not busy teaching or researching at PC, he enjoys keeping bees, reading P.G. Wodehouse to his kids, and going to the beach with the family. So with that, I will now turn things over to Saul, and we will begin this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Arthur. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you tonight about friendship and the emotions in the Hebrew Bible. Until fairly recently, friendship was a subject that received little attention from scholars of the Hebrew Bible, much in contrast to its status in classics, in early Christian literature, and in the study of Ben Sira or Sirach, where it is and has been a well-researched phenomenon. In 2017, as Arthur mentioned, I published a book entitled Friendship in the Hebrew Bible with Yale University Press, and in 2021, an essay on women's friendship for a volume entitled Friendship in Jewish History, Religion, and Culture that was published by Penn State University Press. Others, in particular, Jan Dietrich of Bonn University in Germany, have recently published important studies that advance our understanding of friendship and its representation in biblical and other ancient West Asian literatures. My purpose today is to share with you some of my findings with respect specifically to friendship and the emotions as they are represented in texts of the Hebrew Bible. It's a tricky business, given the ambiguity of Hebrew terms, such as the verbs to love and to cling to, and their derivatives, which are not only used of the relations of friends to one another and family members among themselves, but also of treaty partners. As an aside, I note that to love or to cling to, when used in a treaty context, means simply to be loyal to one's treaty partner and doesn't assume any kind of emotional engagement at all. Furthermore, it behooves us to acknowledge from the beginning that we know nothing of historically situated friends in ancient Israel and can speak only of the ways in which friendship is represented in biblical texts. So that's an important distinction that I want to emphasize. Everything I'm talking about here tonight is literary. It's about the representation of friendship in texts. We can't say anything about a historical David and Jonathan, a historical Ruth and Naomi, just because we don't know. And even here, we must sometimes make arguments to establish that a relationship between two persons is best characterized as a friendship. Given the ambiguity of terms such as Rhea, the most common word for friend in the Hebrew Bible, a word which can also mean a number of other things. Although Rhea appears to mean friend in passages such as Proverbs 17:17, at all times the friend loves and the brother is born to adversity, or Proverbs 27:10, do not abandon your friend or the friend of your father. Its meaning in other contexts evidently includes next door neighbor, as in Deuteronomy 19:14, you shall not move the landmark of your neighbor, that which separates your property, presumably from your neighbor's property. It can also mean peer or colleague who belongs to the same subgroup, as in 1 Kings 20:35, where it refers to a fellow prophet among prophets, or Zechariah 3:8, to a fellow priest among priests. It can also mean peer who is a rival, as in 1 Samuel 15:28 and several other texts, all concerning rivals for the throne, or simply another, a fellow person, as in Genesis 11:3, one said to another, literally, a man said to his Rhea, his fellow. In several well-known texts, it's unclear exactly what the word Rhea means. And here I'm thinking of Leviticus 19:18, love your Rhea as yourself, a text that's familiar to all of us, as well as the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, verses 17-18, or in other Bibles, verses 20-21. You shall love your Rhea, you shall not answer against your Rhea as a false witness. You shall not desire the wife of your Rhea. So these are contexts, both well known, where, at least in my opinion, it's unclear exactly what the word rea means. To further complicate matters, the word rea with the meaning friend is sometimes used of political allies in treaty contexts, as in 1 Samuel 30, verse 26, where David sends booty after a raid to a long list of his friends, the elders of Judah, and Lamentations 1, verse 2, where personified Jerusalem personified as a widow in this text, in mourning, has been treated deceitfully by her allies, who are called both friends and lovers in the passage. Yet political allies are not likely to be personal friends with emotional ties, even if they are called friends or said to love their ally. See, for example, 1 Kings 5:15 or 5:1 in English translations, where Hiram, king of the Phoenician city Tyre, is said to have always loved or been a lover of King David, meaning that as an ally bound by treaty obligations, Hiram had always been loyal to David. Arguments to establish that we are indeed dealing with a friendship and not some other kind of relationship are also necessary when words for friend are not used by our narratives, even though friendship seems as if it were at issue. An example of this is Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth, who never refer to one another as friend, nor are they called friends by others, nor is it at all likely that Ruth's name is related to the Hebrew word re'ut, a noun meaning fellow woman or female neighbor, as in Exodus 11:2, and possibly female companion or friend, as in Jeremiah 9:19, as some have maintained. If the relationship of Ruth and Naomi is best characterized as a friendship, as I believe it is, solid arguments must be made to support this interpretation. For example, the bond is entirely voluntary once Ruth has fulfilled all her obligations to her dead husband and to her mother-in-law, Naomi, something the author is at pains to emphasize in chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. It has reciprocal dimensions. Ruth helps Naomi by providing food. Naomi helps Ruth to secure a new husband. And trust, loyalty, affection, seeking one another's welfare, and doing good, not harm, characteristics of friendship as it is represented in other biblical texts, are in evidence. So much for the caveats. Now, what of friendship and the emotions? Because my time is limited, I'll speak mainly of positive emotions suggested by biblical representations of friendship. Although it's important to note that the focus of many biblical texts is the failure of friends to live up to expectations and the anger and disappointment such failure engenders. A few comments on this before we get to the main part of it. An example of this negative side of friendship and its representation in the Hebrew Bible is Psalm 35, verses 4-8, where the psalmist curses disloyal friends, calling for them to be shamed and to suffer, referring to them as those who seek my life, those who plan my undoing, and my enemies, and contrasting them with loyal friends who are characterized as those who delight in my vindication. A second negative example is Job 19:21, where Job pleads with his friends to treat him favorably rather than acting in an adversarial manner toward him. Act with favor toward me. Act with favor toward me. You are my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you pursue me like God? With my flesh you are not sated. In what follows, I will focus my attention on a number of the most interesting and pertinent biblical texts related to this topic and the particular challenges they pose to reconstructing friendship and the emotions. For those who are interested, A broad survey of friendship in the Hebrew Bible may be found in recent published work on the topic. My first text of interest will come as no surprise to anyone. 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 to 4, the beginning of the Jonathan and David narrative. The text states that the self or life, the nephesh of Jonathan, was bound to the self or life of David, that Jonathan loved David as himself, that Jonathan and David cut a covenant when or because he loved him as himself, and that Jonathan removed his garment and gave it to David, along with his weapons and other personal items, a gesture not unlike Saul's gift of weapons and armor to David, according to the Goliath story in 1 Samuel 17. Actions thought by some to be tied to treaty making. Neither the word rea, with the meaning friend, nor other terms for friend, such as lover, ohev, are used of Jonathan and or David here or elsewhere in the David and Jonathan narratives, nor are they to be found in 2 Samuel 1, verses 19 to 27, David's lament over Saul and Jonathan. Nonetheless, there is reason to describe 1 Samuel 18, 1 to 4 as a text narrating the beginning of a friendship, albeit one that is formalized through the idiom of treaty making, something that appears to be optional for biblical friendships between men. The other text that I found where a friendship is formalized with a covenant, basically a formal treaty between two parties, is in Psalm 55. So it's here and in Psalm 55. And I'll talk a little bit more about formalization at the end of this talk, because it's something that's completely alien to us. Imagine if we had friendships that were formalized by law. That would be very different from the kind of friendships we actually have. Let us turn first to the language of covenant in 1 Samuel 18, 1 to 4. Though it might seem at first glance that loving someone as oneself conveys emotional content, this cannot be assumed in the ancient context, given that the idiom, the very same idiom, is used in ancient West Asian treaty settings to communicate loyalty, and 1 Samuel 18, 1 to 4 is manifestly a treaty setting, as indicated by the mention of Jonathan and David cutting a covenant or treaty. That's the Hebrew idiom, to cut a covenant, karat berit in Hebrew. Esarhaddon, a 7th century king of Assyria, requires his vassals to swear as follows. You swear that you will love Ashurbanipal, the crown prince, the son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, your lord, as you do yourselves. In other words, the vassals of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, bind themselves by oath to be loyal to their overlord's son when he comes to the throne. And such loyalty is described as loving Ashurbanipal, the son of Esarhaddon, as themselves. Given such parallels, it would be difficult to argue convincingly that the idiom to love someone as oneself is necessarily intended to communicate anything about anyone's emotional state. Such is not the case, however, with the statement in 1 Samuel 18:1 that the self or life of Jonathan was bound to the self or life of David. This idiom occurs only one other time in the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 44, verses 30 to 31, it describes the relationship of Jacob to his youngest son, Benjamin, whom he is elsewhere said to love. The self or life of Jacob is said to be bound to that of his son Benjamin. And were Benjamin to die, says the text, Jacob would die of grief. In short, in contrast to the idiom to love someone as oneself, The idiom to bind together selves or lives appears to be highly charged emotionally. Furthermore, it is never used in biblical treaty settings to characterize a non-emotional political relationship in the way to love someone as oneself is. In Genesis 44, 30 to 31, to bind together selves or lives conveys the love of a father for a favorite son, a love so intense that the death of the son would literally put the father in his grave, says the text. A comparably intense emotional resonance is therefore possible for the idiom when it occurs in 1 Samuel 18:1 with regard to Jonathan and David, suggesting the potential for a profound emotional bond between male friends, a phenomenon that may also be evidenced by texts such as 1 Samuel 20:41, Deuteronomy 13:7 to 12, Exodus 32:27, and Proverbs 18:24. I'm going to talk about all those texts. We'll come back to them. I would not want to argue that the bond imagined in 1 Samuel 18:1 is necessarily analogous in all of its details to that of a parent and beloved child, only that it is at minimum represented as emotionally resonant and possibly intense, at least from Jonathan's perspective. To say more than this about the nature of the emotional bond of Jonathan and David according to 1 Samuel 18:1 is, unfortunately, beyond our capacities. Even the nature of the covenant between Jonathan and David in that text is not entirely clear. It may be that the two men are peers or equals, and it may be that they are in some manner unequal treaty partners. It's hard to say based on the information the text provides. My second text of interest is 1 Samuel 20, verse 41, and it also comes from the Jonathan-David narrative. After David comes out of hiding to meet Jonathan, the situation is, according to the narrative, that Saul has done some crazy things and driven David out of his court, and David's a fugitive. But David and Jonathan have a positive relationship. Jonathan, for those who might not know, is the son of Saul, the crown prince. And Saul is king of Israel at this point in time. And David was Saul's star general, but according to this narrative, David's a fugitive from Saul's court. So David's in hiding, and he comes out to meet Jonathan in this particular text. And when he does so, he bows 3 times to Jonathan, an act communicating his subordination. Then we are told that each kissed the other and they wept together. David's subordination to Jonathan breaks down in an emotional reunion characterized by reciprocal ritual acts of affection, which suggest parity between the two men, not a hierarchical relationship. They kiss one another and they weep together. Kissing as a ritual act, can have a strong emotional resonance, as Genesis 33:4 and Ruth 1:9 and 14 suggest. Both of these texts pair kissing with weeping in a context of strong emotion. The reunion of the brothers Jacob and Esau, in the case of Genesis 33:4, the parting of mother-in-law and daughters-in-law in Ruth 1:9 and 14. In Genesis 33:4, as in 1 Samuel 20:41, the subordinate party's multiple acts of prostration before the dominant party precede a breakdown of formal status differences. Yet here, the breakdown is realized not only through reciprocal ritual action, weeping, as in 1 Samuel 20:41, but also through a series of highly emotional acts undertaken by the dominant party. Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, fell upon his neck, kissed him, and they wept. So this is Esau and Jacob, and Esau is the dominant party. Although 1 Samuel 20:41 assumes that Jonathan and David are bound by a treaty in which David is subordinate, The reciprocal ritual acts of affection narrated in this verse strongly suggest a personal emotional bond between David and Jonathan that at moments overrides their formal inequality, a bond best described, in my view, as a friendship. Behavioral parity or reciprocity is a norm of biblical representations of friendship and of biblical friendship vocabulary, even if equality of parties in all respects is not. So you can have unequal parties, various ways in which they're unequal, either by differences in generation, differences in treaty status, differences in what have you. But the behavior is reciprocal. Behavioral parity is a norm of biblical representations of friendship. So we observe elements of such behavioral parity in the Ruth-Naomi narrative, and it is assumed by various texts which advocate the reciprocation of that which is good, the Hebrew word is tovah, to those who do right by us. We see this presumption in Psalm 35, verses 11 to 14, where it is discussed in the breach, and I'll come back to this text. In 1 Samuel 20:41, the behavioral parity is expressed through a series of reciprocal ritual acts, kissing and weeping, as I discussed, not unlike the reciprocal acts of comforting expected of the friend in Psalm 35, 11 to 14. The difference, is in the timing. In 1 Samuel 20:41, behavioral parity or reciprocity is enacted by both parties at once. They kiss one another and weep together. It all happens at the same time. In Psalm 35, 11 to 14, each party to the friendship is expected to play the role of comforter. The Hebrew word is menachem, for those who know, when his friend is in need. So in Psalm 35, each party is expected to play the role of comforter when his friend is in need, and the disloyal friends of the psalmist in that psalm are castigated for failing to reciprocate as expected. And here's what these verses say. Violent witnesses rise up. They ask me about things I do not know. They pay me back evil instead of good. So that statement suggests that they're ex-friends, that they're people who were bound in some way to pay back good, to reciprocate that which is good, but instead they reciprocated that which is evil. And we already know from the text that they're false witnesses in court. They're called violent witnesses, and the setting is legal. And then the psalmist says, but as for me, when they were sick, meaning the ex-friends, my clothes were sackcloth. I afflicted myself through fasting. I mourned the same for a friend as for my brother. I walked around as would one mourning his mother. I was prostrated, dressed as a mourner. So what's probably going on in this text is that the psalmist is referring back to a time in the past when he supported his friends who were sick by donning mourning garb and probably petitioning the deity, Yahweh, on their behalf. So he's complaining, the psalmist, about the disloyalty of his friends in his time of need, even though he did everything he should have done when the friends were sick. Thus, although the psalmist did good things for his friends when they were in need, fulfilling expectations, they reciprocated evil, ra'ah, acting as violent witnesses against him, likely meaning, as I said, acting as false witnesses in a legal setting. In Deuteronomy 13, 7 to 12, Exodus 32, 27, and Proverbs 18, 24, evidence for an emotional dimension of friendship between men is less easily established than it is in 1 Samuel 18:1 and 20:41, although it does seem likely that these texts also bear witness to it. If says Deuteronomy 13:7-10, your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your friend who is as yourself, misleads you in secret as follows. Let us go and serve other gods. You shall not listen to him, nor shall your eye pity him, nor shall you spare or protect him. You shall certainly kill him, the text says. Clearly, these potential offenders are to be understood as a man's closest intimates, and they are mentioned because even they must be executed should they tempt an Israelite to worship gods other than Yahweh. According to this text, aside from family members such as the brother who is the mother's son, the daughter, or the wife, this intimate circle includes the exceptional close friend, described as your friend who is as yourself. Clearly distinguished from other friends by the way in which the text describes him, this friend is implicitly classified with intimate family members as part of the circle of persons closest to the addressee, those the addressee would be most likely to shield from the consequences of their actions, even though they deserve to die in the view of the authors of Deuteronomy. The text seems to be suggesting that one's feelings toward one's intimates have the potential to get in the way of punishment viewed as just by the text and cannot be allowed to do so. Though not explicit, the emotional commitment of the addressee to the relatives and to the exceptional intimate friend is implicit in Deuteronomy 13:7-12. They are the persons the addressee is least likely to be willing to kill for their actions. A second relevant text is Exodus 32:27. Like Deuteronomy 13:7-12, this text addresses what is presented as a serious crime against Yahweh and commands the punishment of its perpetrators without exception. Those who worship the golden calf, according to the narrative, are to be slain by the Levites, who are told, "Thus says Yahweh, God of Israel, let each man set his sword upon his thigh, then pass and return through the camp from end to end, slaying each his brother, each his friend, each his relative." As in Deuteronomy 13:7-12, the friend is classified implicitly with family members, and together these constitute a group of intimates the addressee would be most likely not to want to kill, no matter what they did. The friend is listed between brother and relative, just as the friend of Deuteronomy 13:7 is mentioned along with a number of immediate family members. As in Deuteronomy 13:7-12, Exodus 32:27 suggests that there can be no mercy for those disloyal to Yahweh, even for those closest to the agents of execution. The fact that the text is concerned with intimates suggests that Rhea, the word that I translated friend here, be understood as friend and not fellow or neighbor or peer or something similar. So we have to consider, when the word Rhea occurs, we have to consider what it might mean in each individual text. We have to weigh and balance the possibilities, since there's such a fairly wide range of possible meanings for that one word in the Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible. So here I'm electing to translate it as friend because I think the evidence is pretty clear that that's what it's a reference to. So, as with Deuteronomy 13:7-12, the emotional dimension of the relationship between a Levite and his friend in 32:27 is implicit rather than explicit, suggested by the classification of the friend with family members and the command to kill even them if they have been disloyal to Yahweh by worshiping the golden calf. Another text, a third text that seems to suggest the possibility of an emotional dimension to the relations of at least some male friends is Proverbs 18:24. And this is one of my favorites. There are friends for friendly exchanges, and there is a friend who clings more closely than a brother. This verse not only suggests the possibility of gradations of friendship, close and less close, but also compares the exceptional friend to the brother, using an adjective derived from the verb to cling to, davek. Proverbs 18:24 suggests implicitly an ideal that brothers cling closely, that they are in fact paradigmatic intimates to which others, for example, friends, might be compared. Yet according to this verse, there exists the possibility that an exceptional friend might cling even more closely than a brother. What exactly is implied by this claim? Does the comparison concern loyalty? To cling more closely than a brother, is that to be more loyal than a brother? Does it concern emotional engagement, to be more emotionally engaged with you than a brother would be with you? Does it concern physical presence or some combination of these? Elsewhere, to cling is an idiom of political or cultic loyalty, as in Deuteronomy 11:22 or 2 Samuel 20, verse 2. It's also an idiom of physical proximity, as in Ruth 1:14, 2:8, 2:21, and 2:23. And it's also an idiom of marital intimacy, which likely includes an emotional dimension, as in that famous text in Genesis 2:24, where a man leaves his mother and father and clings, there's that word, clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Same thing in 1 Kings 11, verse 2, concerning Solomon and the various women with whom he was involved. It may be that emotional bonding of friend to friend is suggested by the use of a derivative of the verb to cling in Proverbs 18:24, possibly along with physical proximity and loyalty, given the range of meanings associated with the verb to cling. If there is an emotional dimension to the clinging of the exceptional friend in Proverbs 18:24, it is implicit, as it is in Deuteronomy 13:7-12 and Exodus 32:27. As for other friends, described as friends for friendly exchanges, cocktail party friends, in other words, the verse assumes that they do not cling to the same degree as the exceptional friend, for they are explicitly contrasted with him and implicitly distinguished from the brother. The comparison of the exceptional friend to the brother is typical of texts in which family members are cast as paradigmatic intimates to whom friends or allies might be compared, either explicitly or implicitly, as in Proverbs 19:7. All the brothers of a poor man hate him. How much more so are his friends far from him? Now, that's a sad verse, but you see, we again have the friend brought in and compared to the brother. And the expectation of that verse, Proverbs 19:7, is that the family member would be more loyal and the friend less loyal. So we do have a lot of biblical texts, a lot of texts in the Hebrew Bible that compare friend and family member. I've run through quite a number of them here already tonight, but there's others as well. Typically, as I say, the family member, like the brother or the parent or what have you, are the paradigmatic intimates to whom friends or allies might be compared. As an aside, compare that to our culture, where today we often hear people say things like, my daughter is my best friend, or my son is my best friend, or my father is my best friend. That sort of flips it on its head. Biblical texts never talk that way. They don't use friendship as the paradigmatic relationship and compare familial relations to it. They do the opposite. So that's quite an interesting thing. Now, my final example has to do with women's friendship. Women's friendship with women, which is represented in the Hebrew Bible not only in the relationship of Naomi and Ruth, but also in the narrative of Jephthah's daughter and her friends in Judges 11. Jephthah, one of the judges, makes a rash vow. He will sacrifice whoever comes forth from the doors of his house to meet him when he returns from fighting the Ammonites, an enemy of Israel in this text, should Yahweh keep him safe and give him victory in battle. When Jephthah arrives home after his triumph, his daughter, an only child, comes out to meet him, dancing and playing the hand drum. Upon seeing her, Jephthah tears his garment, a mourning gesture which sometimes is used to acknowledge an anticipated calamity or death. For once a vow is made, it must be paid, as Jephthah acknowledges in verse 35. Jephthah's daughter, whose name is never provided by the narrator, is portrayed as a noble fatalist, accepting the inevitable, though she asks for a modest reprieve. She says, according to the text, "Let this thing be done for me. Give me leave for 2 months that I might descend the mountains and weep over my virginity, I and my friends." She does precisely this, returns and is sacrificed in fulfillment of her father's vow. The pericope ends with a notation that it became a regular observance in Israel for women to commemorate Jephthah's daughter 4 days in the year. How Jephthah's daughter intends to spend her final 2 months of life is not without interest. The purpose of her traveling is to weep over her virginity, which presumably means to bewail the fact that she will die without experiencing sexual intercourse with a man, as the narrator makes explicit in verse 39. And as for her, she did not know a man. To die without knowing a man sexually means to die without bearing children. And this fact likely constitutes at least part of what Jephthah's daughter mourns when she bewails her virginity. Jephthah's daughter's mourning, however, is in company, as all mourning ideally ought to be, for she is accompanied by her female friends in her travels. In verse 37, Jephthah's daughter's friends are mentioned in such a way that the text implies that they too will weep over their friend's virginity. In the following verse, Jephthah's daughter is said to weep, though nothing is said about the ritual behavior of her friends. At all events, the text seems to be suggesting that the friends play the role of comforter for Jephthah's daughter as she experiences or anticipates her calamity, anticipates her death. Although the word comforter is not used by the text to describe them, they behave as comforters in biblical texts do. They are present with Jephthah's daughter, separating themselves from quotidian life with her. They embrace her mourning rites. They weep with her, according to verse 37, not unlike comforters in any number of other texts. You may be familiar with the prologue to the book of Job, where Job's 3 friends come from a distance and they join him in his mourning. They're his comforters. And comforting the mourner in biblical texts can have an emotional dimension when it is associated with consoling, strengthening, or healing the mourner, as in texts such as Jeremiah 16:7, Job 16:5, and Lamentations 1:16 and 2:13. In Lamentations 1:16, personified Jerusalem states that, quote, "Far from me is a comforter, one who would restore my spirit, my person, myself." The word is very, very difficult to translate. It's that word nephesh. suggesting that emotional restoration is a goal of comforting the mourner. In Lamentations 2:13, personified Zion's shattering is said to be vast as the sea, and doubt is expressed that anyone could heal her, suggesting that emotional healing can also be an aim of comforting a mourner. Does the narrative of Jephthah's daughter's travels with her friends suggest an emotional dimension to the friends' comforting? It seems likely to me, given that they are portrayed explicitly doing some of the things comforters typically do for a mourner, keeping the mourner company and weeping with the mourner, and given that they abandon their own daily lives for 2 whole months of wandering with their friend, suggesting a strong personal commitment to her, though nothing explicit is stated about the feelings of the friends for Jephthah's daughter and vice versa, or the degree to which consoling, strengthening, or healing the mourner is their aim. Thus, if there is an emotional dimension to the kind of friendship represented in Judges 11, the story of Jephthah's daughter and her friends, it is implicit in the comforter role assumed by the friends of Jephthah's daughter, as well as their willingness to leave behind their own lives for 2 months to accompany her in her wanderings. I trust that the examples I have discussed convey to some degree the challenges of finding the emotional dimensions of friendship in our textual representations of it. First, we must establish that we are dealing with the representation of a friendship rather than some other social relationship, say the relationship of allies in a treaty, since the evidence is often ambiguous. Then we must strive to identify whether a particular literary representation of a friendship suggests that it is characterized by emotional dimensions. Sometimes the evidence for this is quite strong, as with the use of non-political, non-treaty idiom to bind together selves or lives in 1 Samuel 18:1 of the relationship of Jonathan and David. Sometimes it is not quite as compelling, though still quite likely, as with the examples of the friend who clings more closely than a brother in Proverbs 18:24, or with the friends of Jephthah's daughter in Judges 11, who play the role of comforter for her. Developing an argument is always required. One cannot assume much of anything when analyzing these texts. One final point about biblical friendship. The characteristics of friendship as it is represented in biblical texts frequently overlap with our own notions of what constitutes friendship. Friendship is a voluntary association that can have gradations. Now, that's true of the friendships we're familiar with. We have close friends and we have more casual friends and we have all kinds of friends in between. Also, friendship is characterized by reciprocity, affection, loyalty, trust, seeking one another's welfare and doing good, not harm. Well, that all sounds familiar, at least to me. Yet, biblical friendship also has characteristics that are unfamiliar, even alien to us, such as the possibility that it can be legally formalized. Remember, I said I'd come back to that it can be under contract. There's 2 examples of this in the Hebrew Bible. Or that it is a social relationship shared only by persons of the same gender. Well, that's not really true of our experiences today, at least the people in the circles I hang out in. Although we can find evidence of friendship as a phenomenon through time and space, we shouldn't assume it is the same in every context we might find it. Even in the contemporary world, or for that matter, in America or Europe in the present day, friendship configurations will vary by culture, by class, by gender, by sexual orientation, by generation. Don't have time to talk about that, but it's worth noting. And I thank you for your interest.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Olyan. So now we will turn things over to Professor Long, who will offer a response.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Saul. Saul's book was important to me, has been important to me along the course of my own research. And so I'm honored to be able to offer a response to it now. Professor Olyan's presentation tonight has illustrated the methodological circumspection characteristic of his study on friendship in the Hebrew Bible and the concrete results of it. It's no small task just to sift through the variegated and often very obscure vocabulary used by the biblical writers to designate one's friend. Beyond the necessary lexical sorting, Professor Olyan offers stimulating analyses of the narrative depictions of friendship in the Hebrew Bible. There's much that we would like to know about how these writers experienced and thought about their friendships. We would like to know how this social bond was linked to the emotional life of the participants, for instance. But we quickly find that it's difficult to be precise. Language that we take to be emotive, such as love, is laden with political connotations, used, for example, in suzerain and vassal relationships. And a relationship that's largely informal for us can be formalized as a covenant in its obligations. True, we get expressions of overt indignation in the Psalms, for example, when friends of the psalmist violate their perceived obligations to him. But aside from this indignation in the breach, we have remarkably few positive descriptions of friendship's affective content. I'm reminded at this point of the well-known opening chapter of Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, where Auerbach contrasted the aesthetic effect of Homeric narrative style with that of the Pentateuchal authors. It's characteristic of Homeric style, according to Auerbach, to depict psychological processes in fully externalized form, visible and palpable in all their parts, so that nothing is allowed to remain hidden and unexpressed. So, for example, Achilles in his rage will tell Agamemnon in front of the assembled Achaeans and in front of us, the audience, exactly and in no uncertain terms what he feels about Agamemnon. He doesn't like him at all, as you may recall. Characteristic of Pentateuchal narrative, in contrast, is, quote, the externalization of only so much of the phenomena as is necessary for the purpose of the narrative, all else left in obscurity. The decisive points of the narrative alone are emphasized. What lies between is non-existent. Thoughts and feelings remain unexpressed. They're only suggested by the silence and the fragmentary speeches. The whole remains mysterious and fraught with background, end quote. Spare narrative style, thoughts and feelings left unexpressed, everything fraught with background. This seems to me just as applicable to the descriptions of friendship in the Hebrew Bible as to the binding of Isaac, concerning which Auerbach formulated it. Of course, this doesn't prevent us from wondering what might be discernible in that background, and Professor Olyan teases the affective content out with all due care. Friendship in the Hebrew Bible clearly has an affective content. In the time allotted to me, I would like to turn to consider how this affectively load-bearing social formation is put to some novel uses in one particular Hellenistic Jewish author. I turn to the author known as Ben Sira, to his reception of the Hebrew Bible, and to his treatment of friendship. This Hellenistic author composed a book of wisdom instruction in Hebrew, probably completed by about 180 BCE. The book reads somewhat like the book of Proverbs in the Jewish canon, or at least like the first 9 chapters of that book. That is to say, it consists of paragraph-length discourses on a variety of topics such as social etiquette, the nature of wisdom, wealth and poverty, proper piety, women, and so on. It cycles through its themes so that one gets the full picture of what the sage thinks on a given topic only by reading the entire book and culling the paragraphs related to the topic. Significantly, Ben Sira has quite a bit to say about friends and friendship, having interspersed his book with 7 paragraphs, plus a number of standalone single-verse comments on the topic. Here, too, Professor Olyan has made a significant contribution. His study is the only one of which I'm aware, out of the many that he alluded to approach Ben Sira's didactic wisdom with so thorough a contextualizing description of friendship in earlier Hebrew literature. As one might expect, there's a fair bit of continuity between the Hebrew Bible and Ben Sira with respect to the basic vocabulary of friendship. However, expressions such as to cling to, or that the self or life of person X was bound to the self or life of person Y, are absent in Ben Sira's rhetoric of friendship. As you heard from Saul, these expressions are significant for teasing out the implicit emotional element of friendship in earlier biblical literature. Does their absence here signify less emotional investment? I doubt it, but it does make the job of detecting the affective elements more challenging. As with earlier authors, the affective element remains largely implicit in the sage's wisdom instruction, but it does appear. For instance, one novel element in Ben Sira's teaching about friendship is an emphasis on the possibility of reconciliation in broken friendships. According to Ben Sira, in chapter 22, verses 21 to 22, even if you draw your sword against a friend, do not despair, for there's a way back. If you open your mouth against your friend, do not worry, for reconciliation is possible. But as for disclosure of secrets or a treacherous blow, in these cases, any friend will take to flight. Or again, consider what he says in chapter 27, verses 16 and 17 and 21. Whoever betrays secrets destroys a confidence and will never find a congenial friend. Love your friend and keep faith with him. But if you betray his secrets, do not follow after him. For a wound may be bandaged, and there's hope after, there's reconciliation after abuse. But whoever has betrayed secrets is without hope. Neither of these examples just cited speaks very explicitly of emotions, of course, though the term love did get dropped in chapter 27, verse 17. But they do presuppose the emotional investment of the friends, vulnerable to wounds and harsh words, yet resilient even so, provided that the basic good faith and mutual trust of the friends remains unbroken. But then there's also the melancholy reflection at 37:2, summarizing a possible worst case scenario. Quote, is it not a sorrow like that for death itself when a dear friend turns into an enemy? End quote. Broken friendship is viewed as a considerable emotional blow. Given my limited time tonight and taking a cue from these three examples just cited, I propose to adopt the result of Saul's study as the baseline assumption with Ben Sira as well. That is, friendship is affectively load-bearing here as for older literature. With the remainder of my time, I propose to pursue the following question. To what novel rhetorical or theological goals did the sage deploy the emotionally fraught language of friendship? Let us briefly consider chapter 22, verses 23 to 26. Quote, be loyal to a neighbor in his poverty, in order that you may rejoice in his prosperity. In the time of his adversity, remain constant toward him, that you may be a fellow heir in his inheritance. If your friend becomes poor, do not shame him, and do not hide from him. But if evil befalls him on your account, everyone who hears of it will be on guard against you. End quote. As even a casual glance would suggest, would notice, the motivation for helping a friend or neighbor during his financial hardship, a hope of sharing in his prosperity when his fortunes eventually improve, that's quite pragmatic, to say the least. As some commentators rightly note as well, however, these verses actually complement the first major paragraph on friendship in Sirach found back in chapter 6. There, Ben Sira advised that one should acquire a friend via testing, since otherwise he's likely to be unreliable. Without testing, your so-called friend will abandon you on the day of difficulty, having helped himself to your table and acted as your second self during your prosperity. He can't be found in your adversity. So where Ben Sira earlier cautioned in chapter 6 against inadvertently associating with such an unreliable friend, here in his advice in chapter 22, he now cautions against being the unreliable friend. And just as the instructions found in Sirach chapter 6 offered some pragmatic motivations for following the sage's instructions, that is, one would fail to get help or support in difficult times from an unreliable friend, so hopes for reciprocity prompt appropriate fidelity in friendship according to chapter 22, verse 23. We might glance sideways at a classical source. Xenophon's Socrates is said to have chided a listener for neglecting an impoverished friend, implying that the listener ought to be a help to his friend. This is just one of many offhand examples of Greek hopes for mutual reciprocal aid. When the discussions of Sirach chapter 6 and 22 are viewed together, it seems apparent that Ben Sira assumes something quite similar. He projects a world in which one hopes for faithful friends in the day of adversity, and had better be one as well. Significantly, however, the sage will also advise helping companions when the likelihood of repayment is actually quite low. One thinks here of the admonition in Sirach chapter 29, verse 10, to lose one's money by giving almsgiving. Quote, "Lose your money for a brother and friend, and do not let it rust away under a stone," end quote. Two features of this text are particularly noteworthy at present. First, the parallel between brother and friend is significant. Saul's work has pointed out that these two, kin and friend, share a common classification as intimates, though in prior literature written in Hebrew, the brother-kin relationship is the paradigmatic intimate. I want to explore that and a variation on it in just a moment. Here, I note that for Ben Sira, the friend is more frequently the one to whom help is owed and from whom it is hoped in return. If one studies all the occurrences of brother in his text, one will rarely find it used in a context of teaching about mutual support. More on that in a moment. And a second point, though Ben Sira talks about losing money, lose your money for a friend or a brother, because it's risky to expend resources on someone who cannot help you out in turn. The immediate context also expresses confidence that it will not ultimately be lost, because God himself takes note of generosity, and God will provide for the original giver, even if the needy friend or brother is never in a position to repay. At this juncture, it's worth making what may initially seem a wide detour. Allow me to direct your attention to the book of Deuteronomy, specifically to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. And I've asked Arthur to screen share that quote so you can have it in front of you. There's a document with some of Sirach, chapter 29, and then Deuteronomy 15 there in front of you, just so we can all look at it together. Sorry, hit the wrong button on my computer. 1 second. Here we go. Okay, Deuteronomy 15. Every seventh year you shall grant a remission of debts. If there is among you anyone in need, one of your brothers in any of your towns within the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy brother. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking, the seventh year, the year of remission, is near, and therefore view your needy brother with hostility and give him nothing. He might cry to the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and be ungrudging when you do so. For on this account, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. Since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy brother in your land. It's a curious fact that from the various terms for poverty available in Hebrew, Deuteronomy selects only two, Evyon and Oni, both of which occur in this passage. Moreover, within Deuteronomy, these terms are distributed much more selectively than the terms for the stereotypical personae miserables, represented by the triad, the widow, the orphan, and the resident alien. The triad, widow, orphan, and resident alien, is rather widely distributed in Deuteronomy. You'll find it all over the place. But the two terms for the poor occur only in texts in chapters 15 and 24 that address the question of indebtedness. It's highly significant that the term brother is introduced for the first time within the legal code of Deuteronomy, chapters 12 through 26, here in chapter 15. This paragraph is the first and longest of several that advances a so-called ethics of brotherhood within Deuteronomy. The word brother is used 7 times within an overarching paragraph concerned with debt release, with loans, and with slaves. The larger paragraph is verses 1 to 18, so I've only quoted a part of it. It's emphasized here that the poor and needy are the brother of those in dominant social positions, that is, of actual creditors, mentioned in verses 1 to 6, prospective creditors in the selection I've put before you, and masters of debt slaves in verses 12 to 18. What purpose does this language of brotherhood serve within Deuteronomy? A careful study will suggest that it aims to create or reinforce social solidarity, that is, the formation of a group identity and a shared sense of mutual investment in the group. Personae miserables, here particularly debtors, are represented as kin to whom Israelites owe the good of merciful treatment. Now, these observations are relevant to Ben Sira because the sage has actually made explicit reference to Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 through 11, at least once in his book of wisdom instruction. In his admonition to loan generously to one's neighbor as an act of kindness, found early in Sirach 29. So Arthur, if you could scroll up to that text quoted at the top of the handout. The sage urges that the one who does so keeps the commandments. The commandment that Ben Sira has in mind is most likely the one mentioned here in Deuteronomy 15. Additionally, Ben Sira may have Deuteronomy 15 in mind when he urges extending one's hand to give generously in chapters 4 and 7 of his book. But what seems to me most interesting in light of our conversation this evening is this. Despite the sage's overt references to Deuteronomy 15, and despite his sensitivity to the concrete demands of the brother ethics found in that passage, his own solidarity didactic rarely leans on the term brother. In fact, the admonition I've already cited from Sirach 29:10 to lose one's money by giving alms to a brother and friend is the single most explicit case of brother used in a context of financial support and solidarity. It's the mention of the friend in parallel with the brother that represents the more characteristic mode of thinking for Ben Sira. For in contrast to the relatively sparse use of brother terminology in Sirach, that of friendship carries much of the solidarity didactic load for this sage. Let us return to Sirach 22, 23 to 26 mentioned earlier. As we saw, that text enjoins one to support a friend faithfully even in his poverty, with the expectation of reciprocal sharing in the friend's good fortunes once his circumstances have changed. Professor Olyan has suggested somewhere that this advice develops or improvises on thoughts already extant in the wisdom tradition. Quite so. According to Proverbs 14:20 and 19:7, the friends of a poor man all shun him. Ben Sira now formulates a positive corollary. Faithfulness and support should be displayed toward the impoverished friend. The language is that of friendship, but the thought is easily harmonized with the benevolent action commended under the rubric of brotherhood in Deuteronomy 15. In this light, the pairing of brother and friend in Sirach 29:10 may be especially important, since the outset of this passage cites Deuteronomy 15 as the rationale for benevolent action. Sorry, hit the wrong button again. Let me find that passage. That's what I get for reading off. Sorry, found it. Let's see. In this light, the pairing of brother and friend in Sirach 29:10 may be especially important. Since the outset of this passage cites Deuteronomy 15 as a rationale for benevolent action, it's reasonable to suppose that Ben Sira has been influenced by the brother ethics set out in that passage, and at whatever level of self-consciousness, has assimilated it to the language of friendship, the more pervasive theme in his book of wisdom instruction. One further point about the contribution of Deuteronomy 15 to a mode of thought characteristic for Ben Sira. Within the subunit formed by Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11, the hortatory climax is reached in verse 10 with its emphatic admonition and accompanying motivation clause. You shall surely give to him, that is, to your brother who is poor, and your heart shall not begrudge him when you give to him. For on account of this matter, the Lord your God will bless you in all your activity and in all that you set your hand to. Here, in response to the human gift, because of the giver's act of intrahuman generosity, the Lord undertakes to return the gift as further blessing. In short, generosity to the poor elicits divine repayment in Deuteronomy 15, suggesting an economy of reciprocation that encompasses giver, recipient, and God. This is exactly the move that Sirach 29 also makes. Generosity and almsgiving is a loan to God that God will repay. It's also worth noting that the same subunit in Deuteronomy 15, especially verses 7 through 11, is remarkably clear-sighted about the headwinds that face anyone contemplating making a generous loan to a poor brother. Although this realism appears most clearly in verse 9, awareness of the difficulties is hinted at from the outset. Almost the first word of verse 7 in Hebrew, and certainly the last, reminds the addressee that the loan recipient is poor. And although the close juxtaposition of the terms poor and brother is intended as solidarity didactic, as I've just argued, The rhetorical strategy is really quite risky, since it conspicuously raises doubts about the likelihood of human repayment. The doubt is nudged a step further in verse 8, which issues twin commands for generosity. You shall surely open your hand and loan to him. But once again ends on the note of need. The amount loaned is to be sufficient for the lack he faces. Focus on the lack experienced by the poor man can't help but suggest that repayment is unlikely. Finally, verse 9 articulates the strongest consideration against giving to this brother. Warning the prospective loaner against harboring a mean or miserly thought, the proximity of the Jubilee, enjoined back in verse 1, presents itself as an almost decisive reason not to give. Take care, lest you say, the 7th year of the year of Jubilee is near, with the result that you be stingy with your poor brother and not give to him. With the arrival of the Jubilee year, the loan will effectively be converted into a gift, and just so into a loss for the lender. So, somewhat surprisingly, the didactic rhetoric of Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11 appears structured almost as a sequence of escalating reasons not to be generous. That is to say, it fully acknowledges that there are strong pragmatic reasons against generosity. It's in this light that verse 10 appears most striking. You shall surely give to him, for because of this matter, the Lord your God will bless you in all your activity. A gift given in spite of improbable circumstances, apparently constituting a loss for the giver, will be converted into another round of blessing by God. Risky generosity to the poor elicits divine repayment. This thought too, Ben Sira channels here in Sirach 29 and elsewhere. There are differences between Ben Sira's use of this passage in Sirach 29 and the circumstances likely envisioned by the author of Deuteronomy 15. For example, Ben Sira likely addresses debts in a monetized economy. He mentions silver, coinage basically, rather than those in the agricultural context envisioned in Deuteronomy 15. And the losses envisioned in Sirach 29 are those of default, rather than that of mandatory debt forgiveness. Nevertheless, it's significant that Sirach 29 follows a pattern remarkably similar to that of Deuteronomy 15. Both acknowledge real obstacles facing generosity, yet both advocate generosity anyway, in view of trust that God will repay. Again, I would suggest that Ben Sira has been profoundly attentive to the gist of the brother ethics taught in Deuteronomy 15, but he largely transposes and assimilates it into his own thought and teaching in terms of a friendship didactic. Professor Olyan is correct. Friendship entailed emotional investment on the part of the friends, even though we get only tantalizing descriptions of this reality. The importance of friendship has, if anything, simply grown in volume in Ben Sira's thinking. Interestingly, Ben Sira's teaching on this topic is complicated by reception of a prior biblical text. He's attentive to the social teaching of the Pentateuch, but he rhetorically transposes it into the key of friendship rather than kinship. Thus, the affectively load-bearing social formation of friendship is put to a new kind of social solidarity didactic usage by this Hellenistic Jewish sage. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. So we'll be transitioning now to a period of Q&A. So I'm going to ask if you have questions, you could either begin to raise your hand using the raise hand feature, or put some questions in the chat, and then I'll hand things over to my colleague, Father John Allard, to moderate that. While we're doing that, Saul, let me ask if you have any brief response to Stephen's presentation.
Oh, just that I liked it very much, and it elicited some thoughts that I hadn't had about the material, which is great. Particularly interesting, the whole issue of what is paradigmatic. Is it familial brotherhood? In other words, in the case of Deuteronomy 15, it's metaphorical there, or is it friendship language? And I think you're right. I think Ben Sira does favor one over the other, and that's got me thinking, is this Greek influence also? I mean, it might be.
Right, one does wonder.
Yeah. So thank you. That was great.
Thank you. I've seen hands up first for Sandra Keating and then Kyle Bork, but I think I missed a third hand that went up and may have gone down again. So why don't we start with Sandra first, please? Sandra Keating? No. Could we go to Kyle Bork then? He had his hand up. Then we'll move to the chat. We have from Gary Culpepper, thanks to you, Professor Olyan, and to my colleague, Stephen Long.
I think maybe those may have been claps. I think those may have been claps instead of raised hands. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I misinterpreted.
I didn't see them, but that's what
Okay.
that's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Any questions? I'll throw in a question. This is a question for both of you. But let me ask Saul first. A passage that comes to mind is I think is it Moses who's called the friend of God
Abraham.
Abraham. Okay. And is that the same the Reah, the same word that you were speaking about, or what are the dimensions of? Okay.
It's the other word, ohev. Yeah, it's Stephen was talking about the vocabulary in Ben Sira versus vocabulary in the earlier text. Ohev, lover, literally lover, is used more commonly of the friend in Ben Sira. It's the most common word, whereas it's less common. It's not uncommon, but it's certainly less common than Reah in earlier Hebrew Bible texts. So as I recollected, Abraham is described as the Ohev, the lover of Yahweh. Some people have actually have written on that, including Jan Dietrich, who my German friend and colleague, who also writes on friendship. So we have this whole friendship. And he's written an article on the love of, friendship with God. The way I see it, that probably is treaty language, because in treaty contexts, as I mentioned in my talk, there's plenty of examples where love is required between treaty partners, and treaty partners are described as lovers of their treaty partner, which simply means loyal to their treaty partner. So I kind of consider that, I'm glad you asked about that, but I kind of consider that passage a dangerous one that we might be tempted to read more into than the passage actually suggests in its original setting. So that I'm glad you brought it up, but that's an interesting one.
Any other questions? Oh, Andrew Geist has a question.
I don't know. Can you see me or hear me?
Yes, we can see you and hear you.
Thank you both for a discussion of it, both in the Hebrew Bible itself, later Ben Sira. I was curious for Professor Olyan, especially if to what extent there might be any affective dimension to the treaty language, especially as we find it in Deuteronomy, deployed between, for the relationship between God and Israel.
Yeah, again, it's a good question. A lot of contemporary people are tempted to find in that language emotion. Why don't I just say that in the ancient context, with treaties between, it's tough. On the one hand, I would say that we cannot assume emotion in a treaty relationship between two kings, for example, but we can't assume that it doesn't exist either. So every time we get that kind of affective language, like language of love used of a treaty relationship, I would argue we have to be skeptical, but we can't utterly exclude the possibility. I doubt very much whether Vladimir Putin and Xi have much of an affective relationship, even though they have this alliance that has no limit. But at the same time, who knows? Maybe Hiram, king of Tyre, had affection for David as well. But when the text says that he had always been a lover of David, we can't assume that. The only thing we can assume is that he had been loyal to his treaty with David. So that's a good question and a tough one.
Thanks. Yeah, I would wonder, I suppose, at the root of loyalty, could one presume a necessity of whether that affective dimension is fear, you know, some sense of reverence, negatively or positively construed, or even, you know, more positive
fear,
sense of obligation or some sense
fear
of
because the gods are witnesses to the treaty, whether it's a treaty of equals or a suzerain vassal treaty, whether it involves an oath or doesn't involve an oath, it's still a formal relationship that the gods of each party are called upon to enforce. So I wouldn't say it's wrong to talk about fear, but you know, can there also be something other than that motivates people to keep a treaty? I don't want to utterly exclude the affective side. I just want us to be skeptical and not assume it. Just by way of taking care when we work with the text. But I do appreciate your comments. That was good. Thank you.
So out of curiosity, if I could bounce off of that one. So if treaty language perhaps then doesn't give us much affective language for the relationship between God and Israel, do you think perhaps other metaphors in the Old Testament that, for example, the husband-wife metaphor that's used periodically, would that have affective valence between God and Israel?
Perhaps, or the father-son in Hosea,
right.
Israel
right.
is the firstborn son of Yahweh in one passage. They use, the writers use all kinds of interesting metaphors for the relationship of
right.
Yahweh and Israel. And how much, it's such a tough question. How much effective content is there to any of that? There might be some. I know.
Right. Right. Yeah. You don't want to.
Again, yeah, I can't. I'm one of those scholars who likes to say at this point we're crossing a line into speculation, and that's okay as long as we acknowledge it.
Sure.
It's okay with me. But yeah, because of the nature of the texts we have and the millennia that separate us and the cultural differences and the linguistic differences, it's as you well know as a professional in this field, it's gonna take a lot of effort to be able to say anything with any confidence. And when we can, it's a great thing. I always, when I teach undergrads, I always read from the text and translate in class, and then I ask, what do your translators do with that? And invariably there's going to be differences, and so that gets across to the undergrads what's involved in a field like this, and trying to make sense in our language and also sound okay to our ears. But anyway, no, I'm okay with speculating as long as that we acknowledge that's what we're doing.
Right. Yeah, but you wouldn't want, for example, one wouldn't want to read off sort of modern, romantic love conceptions onto ancient marriage, and therefore read off a straightforward affective element.
I
way.
wouldn't want to assume anything, but I wouldn't want to exclude that either. I mean, what does it mean when a man leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife and they become one flesh? That could easily be affected.
Right. And one also thinks of, say, the Song of Songs or something, where you get this sort of peek into, at least a literary representation of married love.
Of that, yes.
Certainly seems to have some profound affective.
Yeah, I mean, these are people the same as we're people, and there's certainly evidence in the texts that they have feelings and emotions, and I'm not surprised by that. It's just nailing down where we can be confident and what we can be confident in. That is the challenge. But I wouldn't want to argue, no, marriage in the ancient world had no effective dimension.
Right.
I would never argue that.
Right.
Another question.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, we can begin to wrap up. So let me thank Saul and Stephen for being with us tonight and leading us through this really interesting discussion of friendship and emotions. Thank you very much. So let me just say, so for anyone who has registered for the colloquium discussion tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., you should have received a link from me to join the Zoom, as well as the readings. So we'll begin around 10 a.m. I'm also going to throw into the chat the information I promised at the beginning and then forgot to put in the chat. But that is our website, our Twitter, and our email. If you'd like to be on our email list to know about future events, you can email us there. And just one more thing, we have an informational session tomorrow on a program at the Angelicum in Rome in interreligious studies, with the possibility of a fellowship, and this is open to students and grad students as well. Really, the fellowship funds people in the program from all walks of life. So really, this is open to anyone. But this is the information tomorrow afternoon at 4. Just log into Zoom and enter that meeting ID and passcode. And if you have any questions, you can always email me at aurbano@providence.edu. All right. So thank you again. Have a good night, everyone. And I look forward to continuing the discussion with some of you in the morning.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you.